Hi, my name is Jo, and in this video I'm going to talk to you in a little bit more detail about fashion counting as a victimless crime and thinking about how the problem of counterfeiting is one where we can learn about victims, harms and also constructions of crime. So if you're new here, my name is Jo and I am an academic criminologist who works for a university, and I set up the Curious Criminologist so that I can dig into interesting topics around criminology and bring them to you on my channel. In my first video, I talked about my research on fashion counterfeiting and how it led me into studying Zemiology as a way of looking at social harms and also thinking about the fashion industry as a criminologist, by taking a social harms approach and from shifting away from the focus being on the criminal act, we could think about significant levels of harm happening. And particularly we talked about the fashion industry as something where lots of harm happens, and also how by taking a social harms approach we could think beyond the problem of individuals as criminals and to question the role of industries and corporations and things which are systematically harmful as well as just individuals. Whilst I want to keep that broader concern around social harm in mind, I do want to go back to the problem of counterfeiting and thinking about the counterfeit product rather than the legal version. Because one of the things I've really noticed in almost 20 years of researching counterfeiting is just how split opinion is on it. And that's where I think it gets interesting. We hear from some law enforcement officials and policymakers that counterfeiting is this major crime problem and it funds other forms of serious and organised crime. I've even heard people telling me that counterfeiting is something which can fund terrorist activity. And if we look at the latest figures around the global estimation of the economic costs of counterfeiting, it's really quite staggering numbers. So the OECD in 2025 published a report which looks at the economic impact of counterfeit global markets, and they said that they sit at around 467 billion US dollars, which actually equates to around 2.3% of all world trade. This is huge numbers we're talking about. This isn't something insignificant and small. But yeah, when we look at these numbers and we look at these statistics around counterfeiting as a crime problem, but yet we rarely see counterfeiting discussed in the media, we rarely see it discussed in criminology even, and it's very much often perceived by the public as a victimless crime. So it's this contrast about the extremes of the perception of counterfeiting that really sparked my interest as a criminologist. So back in 2006, when I was working as a researcher before I started my PhD, there just really wasn't any academic work on counterfeiting. And in criminology, it only really ever been talked about in relation to money laundering. Counterfeiting was essentially considered a side issue rather than something worthy of study. And actually, I found this status as a crime problem was also something I could see in relation to the policing of it as well. It wasn't really something which the police dealt with at all. In fact, trade-in standards in the UK dealt with counterfeiting, and actually it's very much pitched as a consumer safety issue rather than a crime issue, even though it is a criminal law issue. For me, and I've been arguing this for about 15 years now, if we think about fashion counterfeiting in particular, it brings into question some of the biggest assumptions and questions that a contemporary criminology should be focusing on, and it really helps us to think critically around some questions around crime, offending and victimisation. And I'll no doubt return to many of these going forward with this channel. My research on counterfeiting leaned into understanding consumer perceptions, consumer behaviours, in an attempt to provide some evidence on this, because everything before was just based on assumptions. And I felt that this was really important, especially because so much counterfeit related policy was based on trying to change people's behaviour. And one of the things I did was conducted a survey of over 800 people to give me some descriptive data to understand what people think about counterfeiting, whether they think it's a problem. And then later on I did do some qualitative interviews and focus groups as well. One of the things I did was I used the survey and later the interviews was to explore people's perceptions about counterfeiting as a crime problem. Particularly I was focused on fashion counterfeiting because I felt that fashion had slightly different dynamics to something where there might be a more obvious safety or danger risk. So I wanted to look at something which sits with this idea that it's not unsafe for us. So thinking about a fake football shirt or a fake handbag rather than a fake electrical item which might catch fire, for example. So one of the things which inevitably I focused on was around who victims are of counterfeiting. And my research found that who was perceived of as a victim or not had a very important role in shaping for how somebody understood counterfeiting as a crime problem. And this one quote from my research stands really clear in my memory, despite it being more than 15 years ago now. And one of my participants said, "To be honest, with the levels of real crime, drugs, prostitution, etc. in Britain, I couldn't give a tiny rat's ass about fake goods. Sorry to be rude, but that's my true opinion." I've always found this quote super interesting because for me it really highlights and captures why I find fashion counterfeiting such an interesting topic to study. It gives us this idea of a real crime, and actually this person tells us what they consider are real crimes. It helps us to think about exactly what do we mean by crime and how do we decide when something is a crime or whether it should be a crime. And these questions really sit at the heart of critical thinking within criminology. In criminology, we know that not all types of crime are viewed as serious or even as a crime at all. Fashion fakes being a really good example. We also know about the social construction of crime as an idea, and so we can go back to Box's work, and this, Box 1983 talked about the concept of the real crime and linked that to ideas around power and mystification. But it's not just consumers who question the status of counterfeiting as a crime problem. I've argued throughout my career the distinct lack of discussion and acknowledgement around counterfeiting and other types of intellectual property crimes within criminology allow this more general feeling that it is a victimless crime and not really something we should be focused on. Historically, this idea that counterfeiting is a victimless crime is something which agencies such as law enforcement and anti-counterfeiting groups or regulators have used to explain why the public don't take counterfeiting seriously and why as consumers we continue to buy fakes even though we know they're bad. And actually I certainly found some evidence for people suggesting that counterfeiting wasn't as bad as other things. So another quote from my research was, "Buying fake fashion goods is a small crime compared to burglary, etc." So again, they compared it with other types of crimes. Another participant said, "I don't think it's that big of a problem. I think there are worse things out there than that." So again, this idea that we can put things on some kind of scale from the most serious to the least serious. So this suggestion that there's a sense of seriousness in how we view and how we perceive crime makes sense given the nature of criminal law and punishment, which determines levels of harm and severity as part of our criminal law process. The potential for harm which participants saw was also key in terms of how they perceive seriousness of counterfeiting, and especially of who they considered as victims. So with counterfeiting, people are very quick to dismiss concerns about harm and victims because the conversation is nearly always caught up within the brand. Well, I don't care about counterfeit goods because it's just that brand which is losing money and they don't care about us, or they're really rich, or they charge too much for their products anyway. Unless somebody has a particularly strong association with a brand, then they might have different views because they feel some kind of personal connection with the brand being counterfeited. But generally, people are not that willing to offer much recognition to the brand as a victim within counterfeiting. So the focus then tends to shift onto whether the person buying the counterfeit is a victim or is being harmed within this. And this is interesting because here we get into typical questions around deception and quality, because the interaction of deception and quality shape how whether we see someone as a victim has been duped or whether they're just a savvy, smart consumer getting themselves a bargain. Back in 2010, myself and Professor David Wall wrote a paper where we discussed the interplay of the relationship between deception and harm and quality, and how we could use that as a way of proportioning levels of harm in relation to people buying counterfeit fashion goods. So really simply, we said that there was these two scales. So one was from something from the least deceptive to the most deceptive, and from the poorest quality to the best quality. And depending on where you sit on that scale would depend on the level of harm which you would think. So really simply, something which was super deceptive, so where the consumer had been completely duped into buying it, and at the same time was also poor quality. You've got somebody who buys a counterfeit, doesn't realise they're buying a counterfeit, but it's actually a really bad quality counterfeit. We could say that has the most harm to a consumer compared to somebody who, at the other end of the scale, has the least amount of deception, so they know what they're buying isn't the authentic good, but also the product is a high quality. We would suggest that they might have the least level of harm associated with that counterfeit because they knew what they were buying and actually what they've got is quite good quality. But this might be a useful way to think about the harm to the individual buying the counterfeit. But for me, it's always lacked a sophisticated understanding to think through how we construct what we mean by harm and how we perceive and understand harms, but also, are there other victims in this process? All we're thinking about in this context is either the brand being harmed or the person buying the counterfeit being harmed. Are there not other victims in this situation? Because I'm trying to make shorter videos, I'm going to wrap it up here today. And there's 3 important questions which I want to highlight here. First of all, what does it mean for our understanding of victims if we only focus on the brand and the consumer? Second question, is counterfeiting only harmful to the brand and consumer, or are we missing some people out? Third question, does thinking about a problem like counterfeiting in this way, so focus on the brand and the consumer and its apparent lack of seriousness, reinforce misconceptions about crime? So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I'm going to be following it up with related videos on some of these topics going forward. Thank you.